Hello, and welcome back to Pod Popper's Place for the creative interpretation of this month's Stick It Down challenge. When I first saw the sketch for this month, I thought, wow, this is pretty simple. But when I started actually putting a card together, it became much more complicated than it needed to be, but I love, in the end, the beautiful effect that I achieved. Because there are no measurements for the Sketch It Down challenge, you can make this card size to be whatever you would like. However, the sketch looked to me like it would be more of a slimline size card, so that's the direction that I went. I dug through my giant basket of extra scraps and found some pieces large enough to fit the card. The next challenge was finding pieces in my basket that actually matched each other. I did okay, but I did have to end up bringing out one brand new piece of Sahara sand Stampin' Up! Paper to complete my 5 strips of color. I used this old pattern paper from Stampin' Up! As my inspiration, and I'm using this Spellbinders die that fits end to end to create a border to make a backdrop for my card. 2 notes about this Spellbinders piece. It's great to have these little pieces to fit into and to use for other little projects, those little shapes. I keep those. And then it's also in this kind of copper color, and it does leave like some kind of mark on white paper. You don't see that on the darker paper, of course, but on white paper it does leave some kind of mark from the coating on the die. So for the background, I decided to use those little shapes, and I wanted to add some bling, so I broke out some of the gold glitter paper and added that to both my shapes and my stripes that I'm going to put on the front. Even though my die cuts aren't perfectly aligned, so there's extra space at some of the ends and in between, it will be covered up with the stripes and a lot of the little shapes so that you won't even notice. I originally cut 2 different pattern pieces of paper for the strips, and I also cut those out as the shapes too, but when I added the gold glitter, I decided that I would rather have the gold strip in there rather than the second piece of pattern paper, so I just went with the one original one instead. Knowing that the center bottom portion of my card will be filled up with the stripes, I'm just adding some of the shapes to the bottom part of the card, and then the top, most of the top half, and then the Sahara sand is the backdrop for this card right now, so I don't need to add that shape in there because it's already in the backdrop, and so I'm just adding the other 4 colors of paper. Once I've gotten everything looking how I want it to be, I start the tedious process of pulling everything out, all the shapes out, and gluing them down one by one. Rather than using my T-ruler to line up my 5 strips of paper, I use the center line of white as my center base and just line up my paper starting there. Once each strip is secured in place, I just cut off the extra on the ends. I called this version of the card my creative version. However, this is actually fairly literal as well because of the size of the card and then the 5 stripes, but the background I made quite decorative compared to the sketch itself, and that's why I called it more of my creative design. These strips are cut to 1/4 of an inch, so they are quite wide and really cover up probably more of the card than should have been. So on my literal interpretation, I used a thinner line of only about 1/8 of an inch instead. Part of the literal translation of this card is the very tall and, for me, the very thin capital letters here. These are part of the Sizzix Tim Holtz Thinlits. I did use my T-ruler here to try and line up the letters as straight as possible. What's nice about capital letters is they pretty much all start at the bottom and go up, rather than with the lowercase, sometimes they fall below that line, which makes it harder to line up properly. The double-sided adhesive sheets I used are very sticky, but still were not so sticky that I couldn't lift them up and move them a little bit as I needed to adjust them. I was happy with the placement of the letters. I used my bone folder to really press that down so that the adhesive would really adhere to the paper well. For slimline cards, I usually do around a 4x9 size, and so the last part of this project was just the card base. However, you can see once I put it on there, it was quite small in comparison to the card base, so I needed something else behind it. And then the strip of matching cardstock that I cut was too small, so I decided to cut some corners and just actually cut some corners. And I did that just using some strips of the paper, and then I had these extra corners that were not covered by the paper because it wasn't quite long enough, and so I decided to punch out some squares in the gold to put in each corner to kind of cover up where it wasn't covered by the other pattern paper. And actually I think it looks kind of cool. You'll never know that that's what is behind that top piece of the card, but it's a great way to utilize smaller pieces of paper rather than scrapping them or having to use them for a different project. And then they just go into the leftover bin, and as you can see, my leftover bin is quite overflowing. I do not need anything else additionally in there. I did end up using some double-sided adhesive tape for putting the top layer on because it was quite thick and heavy, and I didn't want any chance of that coming loose. And then I added some just plain gold sequins to the front of the card as shown in the sketch. That completes my card. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Stick It Down Challenge video of my creative interpretation. Look for the literal interpretation as well, and let me know which is your favorite. I hope that you would like and subscribe and come again next month to see what we will be doing for February. All of the details for the challenge are in the box below.